The Venezuela situation just got real, and no one is talking about what it really means.
Let me take you back to July 29, 2024.
That's the day Venezuela's National Electoral Council, controlled, of course, by Nicolas Maduro's government, announced that Maduro had won a third term in a landslide, securing 51% of the vote against opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez's 44%. The streets of Caracas erupted in protests almost immediately.
The U.S. State Department called the election a sham. The EU demanded a full audit. The OAS declared it illegitimate.
And within 48 hours, the Biden administration had already begun quietly mobilizing diplomatic and military assets in the region, framing this as a clear case of democratic backsliding that required a firm response. Now, if you've been following Venezuela for the past decade, this might sound like just another chapter in a long, depressing saga. But here's this time, it's different.
This isn't just another election dispute.
This is the moment Venezuela's crisis stops being a regional problem and becomes a global flashpoint, one that could redefine the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere for the next generation. And if you're only getting your news from mainstream outlets, you're missing the real story.
I've spent the last 25 years studying Latin American geopolitics, first as a scholar, then as an advisor to governments and intelligence agencies. I've written books on U.S. interventionism, the rise of multipolarity, and the ways great powers weaponize instability.
And let me tell you, what's unfolding in Venezuela right now isn't just about democracy.
It's about oil. It's about China's growing influence in America's backyard. It's about Russia's determination to bleed the U.S. wherever it can.
And most importantly, it's about whether Washington still has the capacity or the will to enforce its vision of a unipolar world.
So let's start with the official narrative, the one you've probably heard.
Then we'll peel back the layers.
The official, what they want you to believe.
The story goes like Venezuela, once a thriving democracy, has been ruined by 2 decades of socialist mismanagement under Hugo Chavez and his successor, Nicolas Maduro. The economy has collapsed, inflation has hit 1,000,000%, and more than 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. The 2024 election was supposed to be a turning point, a chance for the opposition to finally unseat Maduro after years of repression, rigged elections, and brutal crackdowns on dissent. But when the results came in, it was Maduro had stolen the election again.
The evidence?
Well, the opposition claims it has tally sheets from 80% of polling stations showing Gonzalez won by a landslide. The U.S. and its allies point to Maduro's history of electoral fraud, his jailing of political opponents, and the fact that the National Electoral Council has never been independent. The EU's election observation mission, which was allowed into the country under strict conditions, released a scathing report noting serious irregularities and a lack of transparency. And then there's the human rights. Maduro's forces have already arrested dozens of opposition figures since the election, and reports of violent repression are flooding in.
The U.S. response has been swift. Secretary of State Antony Blinken called the election neither free nor fair and announced new sanctions targeting Venezuela's oil sector.
The Treasury Department has frozen assets and restricted financial transactions. And in a move that hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, the Pentagon has quietly repositioned naval assets in the Caribbean, including the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group, which is now conducting routine exercises off the coast of Colombia. Meanwhile, the White House has begun floating the idea of recognizing Gonzalez as Venezuela's legitimate president, a move that would effectively create a parallel government and set the stage for a potential showdown.
This is the story you're hearing. And on the surface, it makes sense. Maduro is a dictator. The election was flawed.
The U.S. is the global champion of democracy, and it should stand up to authoritarianism.
But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete. And in geopolitics, an incomplete story is often a dangerous one. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the election itself. Yes, Maduro is an authoritarian. Yes, the election was not free and fair by Western standards. But here's what the media isn't telling: the opposition knew the election would be rigged.
They knew Maduro would never allow a fair vote.
And yet, they still participated. Why? Because this wasn't just about winning an election. It was about delegitimizing Maduro in the eyes of the world.
The opposition strategy, orchestrated in part by US and European advisors, was to use the election as a pressure point, to create a crisis that would force Maduro into negotiations or, failing that, justify more aggressive intervention.
The tally sheets the opposition is waving around?
They're real, but they're also part of a carefully planned information operation. The goal wasn't just to prove fraud, it was to create a pretext for regime change. Now, let's talk about the US response.
The sanctions, the naval deployments, the talk of recognizing a parallel government, this isn't just about democracy. It's about oil.
Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, even bigger than Saudi Arabia's. For years, the US has been trying to starve Maduro's regime of revenue by cutting off its oil exports. But here's the China and Russia have stepped in to fill the gap. In 2023 alone, China imported nearly 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, much of it at a discount, and Russia has been helping Maduro evade sanctions through a complex web of shell commies and shadowy financial transactions.
So when the US imposes new sanctions, it's not just punishing Maduro, it's pushing Venezuela deeper into the arms of Beijing and Moscow. And that's a problem, because Venezuela isn't just a failed state. It's a strategic asset. Control over Venezuela's oil gives China leverage over global energy markets. It gives Russia a foothold in the Western Hemisphere, just 1,500 miles from Miami. And it gives both countries a way to undermine US influence in Latin America, a region Washington has long considered its exclusive sphere of influence. But here's where it gets really interesting. The US isn't just reacting to Maduro's election fraud. It's provoking a crisis. And it's doing so at a time when its own domestic politics are in turmoil. Let me explain.
The extra geopolitical why this is about more than Venezuela.
To understand what's really happening in Venezuela, you have to out. This isn't just about one country.
It's about the broader struggle for global dominance between the US, China, and Russia. And it's about whether the 21st century will be defined by a single superpower or by a multipolar world where regional powers carve out their own spheres of influence. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can and should shape the world in its image. This is the doctrine of liberal, the idea that the US has a moral and strategic obligation to promote democracy, free markets, and human rights everywhere, by force if necessary. It's the logic behind Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and countless other interventions. And it's the logic behind the current push in Venezuela. But here's the liberal hegemony is failing. The US is overextended. Its military is stretched thin. Its economy is burdened by debt. And its political system is deeply polarized. Meanwhile, China and Russia have been quietly building alternative institutions, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRICS bloc, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, that challenge US dominance without directly confronting it. They're not trying to replace the US as the global hegemon. They're trying to create a world where no single power can dictate the rules. Venezuela is a perfect example of this dynamic. For China, Venezuela is a key node in its global energy network. For Russia, it's a way to distract the US and force it to divert resources away from Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific. And for the US, it's a test of whether it can still enforce its will in its own hemisphere. If Washington can't even control what happens in its backyard, how can it claim to be the leader of the free world? This is why the current crisis is so dangerous. The US is trapped in it. It can't afford to let Maduro win, because that would signal weakness and embolden China and Russia. But it also can't afford a full-scale intervention, because the American public is exhausted by foreign wars, and the military is already overstretched. So what does it do? It tries to thread the needle, imposing sanctions, supporting the opposition, and hoping Maduro collapses under the pressure. But as we've seen in Syria, in Iran, in North Korea, this strategy rarely works. Authoritarians don't fall because the West wants them to. They fall when their own people turn against them or when their patrons in Moscow and Beijing decide they're more trouble than they're worth. And that brings us to the most important question of what do China and Russia want in Venezuela? The great how China and Russia are playing the long game. Let's start with China. Beijing doesn't care about democracy in Venezuela. It cares about stability, access to resources, and undermining U.S. influence. And right now, Maduro is a useful partner. China has invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, and it's using the country as a testing ground for its digital authoritarianism, helping Maduro build a surveillance state that would make Orwell blush. But China is also hedging its bets. It's quietly cultivating relationships with opposition figures, just in case Maduro falls. And it's using Venezuela as a bargaining chip in its broader negotiations with the U.S. over trade, Taiwan, and the South China Sea. Russia, on the other hand, is playing a more aggressive game. Moscow sees Venezuela as a way to bleed the U.S. and force it to divide its attention. In 2019, Russia sent military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries to Venezuela to prop up Maduro. In 2020, it deployed nuclear-capable bombers to the country in a show of force. And in 2023, it began supplying Venezuela with advanced air defense systems, including the S-300 missile system, which could make any U.S. military intervention far more costly. Now, here's the Russia and China aren't coordinating their Venezuela strategies in lockstep. But they don't have to. They're both pursuing the same goal, weakening U.S. dominance, and they're both happy to let the U.S. tie itself in knots trying to solve a problem it created. And that brings us to the military dimension of this crisis. Because while the U.S. is trying to avoid a direct confrontation, the risk of miscalculation is higher than it's been in decades. Military: the risk of a miscalculation. Right now, the U.S. has a carrier strike group in the Caribbean, special forces in Colombia, and drones surveilling Venezuela's borders. The Pentagon has drawn up contingency plans for everything from a limited airstrike on Maduro's compound to a full-scale invasion. And the White House is under pressure from hawks in Congress to do something before the situation spirals out of control. But here's the thing about military: they never go as planned. Iraq was supposed to be a quick war. Afghanistan was supposed to be a nation-building success. Libya was supposed to be a humanitarian triumph. And yet, in every case, the U.S. ended up bogged down in a quagmire, spending trillions of dollars and thousands of lives for little strategic gain. Venezuela would be no different. The country is twice the size of Iraq, with a population of 28 million and a terrain that includes dense jungles, towering mountains, and sprawling urban slums. Maduro's military is battle-hardened, with Russian and Iranian advisors embedded at every level. And unlike in Iraq or Afghanistan, the U.S. wouldn't just be fighting Maduro's forces, it would be fighting Russian mercenaries, Iranian-backed militias, and potentially even Chinese cyber units. Now, I'm not saying the U.S. can't invade Venezuela. It absolutely can. But it would be a disaster. And the real question: what would victory even look like? Would the U.S. occupy the country indefinitely? Would it install a puppet government? Would it try to rebuild Venezuela's economy, only to watch it collapse again in a few years? These are the questions no one in Washington is asking, because the answer is there is no good outcome. But here's the most dangerous: the risk of escalation isn't just about a U.S. invasion. It's about a miscalculation. What if a U.S. drone is shot down by a Russian-made missile? What if a U.S. Special Forces team is captured by Venezuelan forces? What if Maduro, desperate to cling to power, launches a cyber attack on U.S. infrastructure? These are the kinds of scenarios that keep military planners up at night, because they're the ones that can spiral out of control before anyone realizes what's happening. And that brings us to the domestic political dimension of this crisis. Because while the geopolitical stakes are high, the real driver of U.S. policy isn't strategy, it's politics. The domestic political: why Biden can't afford to look weak. Let's be: Joe Biden doesn't care about Venezuela. Neither does Donald Trump. Neither does any U.S. president. What they care about is domestic politics. And right now, Venezuela is a political liability for Biden in 3 key ways. First, there's Florida. The state is home to nearly 300,000 Venezuelan exiles, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are now U.S. citizens. They vote, and they vote Republican. Trump won Florida in 2020 by just 371,000 votes, and the Venezuelan American community was a key part of his coalition. If Biden is seen as soft on Maduro, he risks losing Florida in 2024, and with it, the election. Second, there's the broader issue of immigration. The US is already struggling to handle the influx of migrants at its southern border. If Maduro falls and Venezuela collapses into chaos, millions more Venezuelans could flee to the US. Biden's administration is already under fire for its border policies, and the last thing it needs is another migration crisis. Third, there's the question of credibility. Biden has staked his foreign policy on the idea that the US is the leader of the free world, and that democracies must stand together against authoritarianism. If he backs down in Venezuela, it sends a message to every dictator on that the US won't follow through on its threats. And that's a message Biden can't afford to send, especially with Trump breathing down his neck, accusing him of being weak on China and Russia.
So what does this mean? It means Biden is trapped. He can't ignore Venezuela, because it would hurt him politically. But he also can't escalate too aggressively, because the risks are too high. So he's trying to walk a tightrope, imposing sanctions, supporting the opposition, and hoping Maduro blinks first. But as we've seen time and time again, authoritarians don't blink. They double down. And that brings us to the most likely scenarios for how this crisis plays out. Scenario how this ends. Let's be there are no good options in Venezuela. Every possible outcome carries serious risks. But based on my analysis, here are the three most likely scenarios, ranked by probability.
Scenario 1, the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the US and its allies continue to apply economic and diplomatic pressure on Maduro, but stop short of military intervention.
The opposition remains in limbo, neither fully in power nor fully crushed.
Maduro survives, but his regime becomes increasingly isolated and dependent on China and Russia. Venezuela's economy continues to stagnate, and the country remains a failed state, but it doesn't collapse entirely. This is the Syria model, a low-level conflict that drags on for years, with no clear resolution.
The upside? It avoids a direct US-Russia or US-China confrontation. The downside?
It leaves Venezuela in a state of perpetual crisis, with millions more fleeing the country and the US looking weak and indecisive.
Scenario 2, the proxy war.
In this scenario, the US and its allies ramp up support for the opposition, providing weapons, training, and intelligence. The opposition launches a sustained insurgency, with backing from Colombia, Brazil, and possibly even US special forces.
Maduro responds with brutal repression, and the country descends into civil war.
Russia and China increased their support for Maduro, turning Venezuela into a proxy battleground for great power competition.
The upside? It could force Maduro out without a full-scale US invasion. The downside?
It could also lead to a prolonged conflict, with Venezuela becoming a magnet for jihadists, drug cartels, and foreign mercenaries.
And if the US gets too deeply involved, it risks a direct confrontation with Russia or China. Scenario 3, the full-scale intervention. This is the nightmare scenario.
The US launches a limited airstrike on Maduro's compound, or sends in special forces to capture him. Maduro retaliates by attacking US assets in the region, or by launching cyber attacks on US infrastructure. Russia and China respond by increasing their military support for Maduro, and the conflict escalates into a regional war. The US finds itself bogged down in another endless occupation, with no clear exit strategy.
The upside? Maduro is removed from power. The downside? Everything else. The US would be seen as an imperialist power, Latin America would erupt in anti-American protests, and the global economy would be thrown into chaos as oil prices skyrocket. And worst of all, it would set a precedent for future interventions, making the world even more dangerous. Now, I know what some of you are, but what about the people of Venezuela? Don't they deserve democracy? Of course they do. But here's the hard: democracy can't be imposed at gunpoint. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the unraveling of the entire post-Cold War order in Latin America.
The region has spent the last 3 decades trying to escape the shadow of US interventionism, only to find itself caught between two equally destabilizing: the resurgence of authoritarian populism and the return of great power competition. Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine, and the gas is already leaking. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has spent the better part of the 21st century trying to redefine its role in Latin America, shifting from the heavy-handed interventions of the 20th century to a more subtle, economic-focused approach. The Obama administration's normalization of relations with Cuba in 2014 was supposed to signal a new era, one where Washington would engage with the region on terms that didn't involve coups, covert ops, or the Monroe Doctrine. But then came Trump, and with him, the resurrection of Cold War rhetoric. Troika of tyranny wasn't just a catchy phrase, it was a declaration that the US was back in the regime change business. And now, under Biden, we're seeing the same old playbook, just with a slightly more diplomatic veneer. Here's the uncomfortable: the US foreign policy establishment has never really moved on from the idea that Latin America is its backyard. The problem is, the backyard has changed. The region is no longer a collection of banana republics waiting for Washington's next directive. It's a patchwork of sovereign states with their own interests, alliances, and grievances. Colombia, once the US's most reliable partner in the region, is now led by Gustavo Petro, a leftist who has openly criticized US militarization and called for a negotiated solution in Venezuela. Brazil, under Lula, has walked a tightrope between condemning Maduro's authoritarianism and rejecting US interventionism. Even Mexico, which has its own complicated history with the US, has refused to recognize Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate leader. This is the geopolitical reality that Washington keeps ignoring. The US can't just snap its fingers and expect Latin America to fall in line anymore. And yet, that's exactly what it's trying to do. The sanctions, the diplomatic pressure, the covert support for the opposition, it all assumes that the region will eventually bend to US will. But what happens when it doesn't? What happens when Colombia and Brazil decide they'd rather have a stable, if authoritarian, Venezuela on their borders than a failed state overrun by cartels and mercenaries? What happens when Mexico, already struggling with its own security crisis, refuses to be dragged into another US-led intervention? Now, let's talk about the military implications, because that's where things get really dangerous. The US has been quietly ramping up its military presence in the region for years, under the guise of counter-narcotics operations and humanitarian assistance. In 2020, the Trump administration reactivated the Fourth Fleet, which had been mothballed since the 1950s, to oversee naval operations in the Caribbean and South America. The U.S. Southern Command has been conducting more frequent military exercises with regional partners, including Colombia and Brazil. And in 2022, the U.S. deployed a carrier strike group to the Caribbean for the first time in years, ostensibly for training, but also as a not-so-subtle message to Russia and China. Speaking of Russia and China, they're not sitting this one out. Moscow has been Maduro's most vocal military backer, sending in Wagner Group mercenaries, advanced air defense systems like the S-300, and even nuclear-capable bombers for joint exercises in 2018. China, meanwhile, has been playing the long game, investing billions in Venezuela's oil sector and providing loans that Caracas can't repay, ensuring that Beijing will have leverage over Venezuela's resources for decades to come. Both countries see Venezuela as a strategic foothold in the Western Hemisphere, a way to project power and undermine U.S. influence. So what happens if the U.S. decides to escalate? Let's say Washington greenlights a proxy war, arming the opposition and turning Venezuela into a battleground. Russia and China aren't going to stand by and watch their ally collapse. They'll respond in kind, increasing their military support for Maduro, setting up forward operating bases, and maybe even deploying their own forces under the guise of peacekeeping. And that's when things get really messy. Because once you have Russian and Chinese troops on the ground in Venezuela, you're no longer just dealing with a regional crisis, you're dealing with a global one. Here's another uncomfortable: the U.S. military is not prepared for this. The Pentagon has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, not preparing for great power competition in its own hemisphere. The U.S. Navy is stretched thin in the Pacific, trying to counter China's growing fleet. The Air Force is dealing with aging aircraft and pilot shortages. And the Army? It's still trying to recover from the debacles in Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea that the U.S. could sustain a prolonged military campaign in Venezuela, let alone one that risks direct confrontation with Russia or China, is delusional. And let's not forget the wildcards. Venezuela shares a porous border with Colombia, which is already a haven for drug cartels, paramilitary groups, and leftist guerrillas. If Venezuela collapses into civil war, those groups will flood in, turning the country into a narco-state on steroids. The US has spent billions trying to stabilize Colombia. A Venezuelan civil war would undo all of that progress overnight. And then there's the humanitarian crisis. Venezuela is already home to one of the largest refugee populations in the world, with over 7 million people having fled the country since 2015. A full-scale war would send millions more streaming across the borders, overwhelming Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The US would be left holding the bag, forced to either intervene or watch as the crisis spirals out of control.
Now, I know what some of you are, but what about the people of Venezuela? Don't they deserve better? Of course they do. But here's the democracy can't be imposed at gunpoint, and neither can stability. The US has a long and ugly history of intervening in Latin America under the guise of democracy promotion, only to leave behind chaos and resentment. Guatemala in 1954, Chile in 1973, Nicaragua in the 1980s, these weren't just failed interventions, they were disasters that set the region back for decades. And yet, here we are again, dusting off the same old playbook and expecting a different result. The real solution to the Venezuela crisis isn't military intervention or regime change. It's diplomacy.
It's engaging with Maduro not because he's a good guy, but because he's the one in power, and you don't get to pick your adversaries in geopolitics. It's working with regional partners like Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico to find a negotiated solution that avoids further bloodshed.
And it's recognizing that the US can't just bully its way to stability in Latin America anymore. The region has changed, and Washington needs to change with it. But that's not what's happening.
Instead, we're sleepwalking into another crisis, one that could have catastrophic consequences for the entire hemisphere.
And the scariest part?
No one in Washington seems to realize just how real this has become.
Now, what most people don't realize is that the domestic political situation in Venezuela is far more fragile than the regime's propaganda would have you believe. Maduro's government isn't some monolithic, unshakable force, it's a house of cards propped up by repression, economic distortion, and sheer exhaustion.
The opposition, meanwhile, is fractured, demoralized, and increasingly irrelevant in the day-to-day lives of most Venezuelans.
But that doesn't mean the status quo is sustainable.
In fact, the cracks are widening in ways that could trigger a sudden collapse, or worse, a violent implosion.
Let me explain why this matters.
For years, the narrative in Washington has been that Maduro is a dictator clinging to power through brute force, and that the opposition, led by figures like Juan Guaidó, represents the legitimate democratic alternative.
That framing was always simplistic, but it's now dangerously outdated. Guaidó's interim government, recognized by the US and its allies as Venezuela's legitimate authority, has all but collapsed.
In December 2022, the opposition-controlled National Assembly voted to dissolve it, effectively admitting that the strategy of international recognition without domestic control had failed. The Biden administration, to its credit, quietly dropped its support for Guaidó in early 2023, but the damage was already done. The opposition is now a shadow of what it was in 2019, when millions took to the streets in protest, and the regime's survival no longer depends on crushing dissent, it depends on ensuring that no one, not even the opposition, has the capacity to challenge it. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro's regime is not popular, but it is resilient. It has survived hyperinflation, US sanctions, mass protests, and even a failed coup attempt in 2019.
How? By turning the state into a predatory machine that rewards loyalty and punishes defiance.
The military, the judiciary, and the ruling party's inner circle have all been bought off with control over lucrative sectors of the economy: oil, gold, drugs, and even food distribution. The National Guard, for example, doesn't just enforce order, it runs the black market for gasoline, which is rationed and sold at exorbitant prices. The military's top brass, meanwhile, controls the gold mines in the south, where illegal mining has turned the Amazon into a lawless zone.
This isn't governance, it's a protection racket. And it works until it doesn't. The real wild card isn't the opposition, it's the regime's own internal fractures. Maduro has spent the last decade purging potential rivals, but that doesn't mean the infighting has stopped. In fact, it's gotten worse.
The most recent example came in March 2024, when Diosdado Cabello, the regime's second most powerful figure and a longtime Maduro ally, publicly criticized the government's economic policies in a rare display of dissent. Cabello, who controls the ruling party's machinery and has deep ties to the military, didn't call for Maduro's ouster, but his comments were clear the elite is getting restless. Then there's the case of Tariq El-Sami, the former oil minister and vice president who was sanctioned by the US for drug trafficking. In 2023, he was abruptly sidelined, and rumors swirled that he had fallen out of favor, or worse, that he was cooperating with US authorities. The regime denied it, but the fact that such speculation could even gain traction speaks to the paranoia within the inner circle. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so the regime is corrupt and unstable, why does that matter if it's still in power? Because these fractures create opportunities for miscalculation. If Maduro feels his grip slipping, he might lash out, either by cracking down harder on dissent or by manufacturing a crisis to rally support. We've seen this movie before. In 2017, when protests threatened to spiral out of control, Maduro called for a constituent assembly to rewrite the constitution, effectively neutering the opposition-controlled legislature. In 2019, when Guaidó declared himself interim president, Maduro responded by arresting opposition leaders and shutting down the last remnants of independent media. The pattern is when the regime feels threatened, it doesn't negotiate, it doubles down. But here's the Maduro isn't just fighting the opposition anymore. He's fighting history. Venezuela's economy is a basket case. The IMF estimates that GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, a collapse on par with the Great Depression. Oil production, which once accounted for 95% of export revenue, has plummeted from 3.5 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 today. The country's infrastructure is crumbling, blackouts are routine, water shortages are chronic, and hospitals lack basic supplies. The regime has tried to paper over the crisis with dollarization, allowing businesses to operate in U.S. currency, but that's only deepened inequality. The vast majority of Venezuelans survive on remittances from family abroad or by working in the informal economy, where wages are measured in dollars but prices are set by inflation. The result? A country where the elite live in gated communities with private generators and armed guards, while the rest scavenge for food in garbage dumps. So what happens next? There are three plausible scenarios, and none of them are good. The first is a slow-motion collapse. The regime muddles through, using repression and economic control to keep the population in check, but the country becomes a failed state in all but name. This is the most likely outcome in the short term, but it's also the most dangerous. A failed state isn't stable, it's a breeding ground for crime, terrorism, and regional instability. We've seen this in Somalia, in Libya, in Afghanistan. Venezuela isn't there yet, but it's heading in that direction. The second scenario is a palace coup. Maduro is ousted by a faction within the regime, likely led by someone like Cabello or Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez. The new leadership would promise reforms, maybe even hold elections, but the underlying system wouldn't change. The military would still control the economy, the opposition would still be marginalized, and the country would still be a narco-state. This is what happened in Zimbabwe in 2017, when Robert Mugabe was replaced by his own deputy, Emerson Mnangagwa. The faces changed, but the system stayed the same. The US might be tempted to recognize the new government as a transition, but it would be a mistake. A coup wouldn't solve Venezuela's problems, it would just entrench them under a new name. The third scenario is the most popular uprising that spirals into civil war. This is the nightmare scenario, and it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The regime's control isn't absolute. In 2019, protests brought the country to a standstill. In 2020, a group of dissident soldiers launched a botched raid on a military outpost, a sign that even the security forces aren't monolithic. If the economy deteriorates further, or if Maduro makes a major misstep, like arresting a popular opposition figure or rigging an election too blatantly, the streets could erupt again. And this time, the military might not be willing to shoot its own people. We saw this in Sudan in 2019, when the army turned on Omar al-Bashir after months of protests. The difference in Venezuela is that the military is deeply complicit in the regime's crimes, which means a split could turn violent fast. Now, I know what some of you are, but what about the elections? Isn't Maduro holding a vote in July 2024? Yes, he is. And no, it won't be free or fair. The regime has already banned the most popular opposition candidates, including Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition's primary in October 2023 with over 90% of the vote. The government has also arrested dozens of opposition activists, shut down independent media, and gerrymandered electoral districts to ensure a Chavista victory. The Biden administration has called the election a sham, but that's not enough. The real question is what happens after the vote. If Maduro steals the election too blatantly, it could trigger another wave of protests. If he allows a token opposition figure to win a few seats, it could give the regime a veneer of legitimacy while doing nothing to address the underlying crisis. Here's the bottom: Venezuela is a tinderbox, and the fuse is getting shorter. The regime is weaker than it looks, but that doesn't mean it's on the verge of collapse. It means it's more dangerous. A weak regime is a desperate regime, and desperate regimes do reckless things. Maduro has already shown that he's willing to use violence to stay in power. The question is whether he'll escalate if he feels cornered. And if he does, the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas, they'll ripple across the region, from Bogota to Brasilia to Miami. The U.S. has two choices. It can continue to treat Venezuela as a geopolitical chess piece, imposing sanctions and hoping for regime change. Or it can recognize that the old playbook isn't working and try something new: diplomacy, engagement, and a realistic assessment of what's possible. The first option might feel satisfying, but it's a recipe for disaster. The second is harder, messier, and less satisfying to the hawks in Washington. But it's the only one that might actually work. The problem is that no one in power seems to be thinking that far ahead. And that's how crises become catastrophes.